Hello everyone, today we talk about Western European warhorse and harness from the 7th to the 10th century AD. Alright, this is for our military historical units series. It would be a huge topic if we were really to address in far depth the actual zootechnical dimension of this era. That is a sort of in-between, like sort of end tail strike of the migration era, plus essentially some vassalitic beneficiary, aka proto-feudal development in the High Middle Ages. We will looking at many cultures, in particular the Latin Germanic kingdoms, but we will analyze also the Vikings, Central Europe, the influence of the Magyars in this, also the one of the Arabs from the south and or from the general imports that had kept going on in Europe. Speaking of equestrian trade since antiquity. And in fact, it's a huge topic for a number of reasons. First of all, there is a veritable equine genetic history that is naturally a bit more complicated than the human one, in as much as horses were obviously not buried exactly in the same ways, especially at this point throughout Christianization. So the lack of, at some point, entire horses in the graves together with the same panoply of the warrior. In some cases, we're lucky. We know, of course, what was happening in the Eurasian steppes, and we'll see, of course, how close still at this point these steppes really were to Western European warfare, because from our perspective, yes, the migration era sort of ended, especially with the Longobard settlement in Italy, but Central and Eastern Europe kept going under sort of repeated waves of nomadic conquest/settlement that eventually also created problems further west, and or at least had their own influence. In all this, we shouldn't, of course, either underplaying the already substantial advancement of Western European, we could say equestrian, but proto-knightly warfare, at least if we intend as the knight, sort of the more typical man-at-arms of the later, of the 12th century. Even though the knight, as you know, existed quite consistently already as a prototype/archetype from the steppes from millennia in all, also the European sedentary cultures that, for example, in antiquity, did not have really cavalry as the superior arm in their armored forces, but were essentially fixated with equestrian mythology all across. And we know this very well from theology, from ethnography, from basically any kind of indicator available. All right, and this, for example, is an interesting topic in and of itself, because I remember when I started Schwerpunkt, one of the first questions, I think the very first one I answered, all right, even though the question and answer series did not exist yet, I don't remember, and I should actually insert whether I inserted it in the question and answer series playlist. It could be an honorary path opener there concerning essentially where did sort of feudal cavalry come from, like from a sort of later medieval Western perspective. And I, at least at the time, now it's several years ago, today people have become perhaps overall less knowledgeable about history than before, but still perhaps slightly better guided, especially as far as warfare is concerned. And at least at the time, there was this impression that basically the West owed everything to the East for some strange reason, or in this case, especially not much to the steppes. In some important Indo-European legacy that is a discussion that we made regarding Göktürk warfare the other day, realizing that many of these so-called Turks were actually Indo-Europeans in ancestry. And so I'm not going to discuss this. I made a pretty hefty series about Eurasian steppes warfare, looking at the various steps of nomadic warriors at a point, and what in fact changed in their armament, in their harness, and so on, so that you can check that out. But again, the notion is that everything was taken from the East, from the Middle East. The Sasanian cataphracts basically would be the prototype of the Western Knight. No, even though there is a connection, it's not a direct one nor a causal one. And there isn't even actually that enormous influence from Arab warfare either, because when we look at this, especially from the Iberian Peninsula, you realize, first of all, those were, as for most of the Islamic conquests, they were just Arabicized elites, and in that case, they were mostly Berbers, that is, North Africans, not Arabs. And in any case, their warfare mostly revolved around infantry. And when you look, I don't know, at the Franks of Charles Martel, but even just the Merovingians in the later period, they had, or even the early one, they actually had pretty strong cavalry in many ways. Naturally, there are different sources that tend to present different pictures. For example, if you read the Strategicon, you realize that aside from the beautiful compliments made by, in fact, the Byzantines to the so-called blonde-haired peoples, the main criticism towards these forces that, by the way, exactly in that moment were employed for the time standards en masse in the imperial armies, was a general lack of collective training of some sort, which does fit, generally speaking, the relative political fragmentation of the various peoples, especially if you look at that point, the Longobards. If you read many Strategicon sort of critical editions, they will tell you that these blonde-haired peoples are basically the Franks and or the Germans in general, right? Or these people from, again, Central, Northern Europe, whatever. But at the time, exactly in the years in which the author of the Strategicon, we were talking at the reign of Mauritius, also recently made a video about the Maurician Caballarius, that in many ways was actually a Germanic horseman serving in the imperial army, that these guys were Longobards and thus fit pretty much like a very interesting picture. It was also a bit more steppe influence compared to the Franks, for example. I decided to give this timeline today, the 7th to the 10th centuries, also not to open the Gothic parenthesis, at least as far as the Ostrogoths were concerned. There are the Visigoths in Spain that in part had been normalized along sort of more Roman patterns, but when you realize that, yes, these were tendentially feudal societies, or at least they were heading toward that, especially in Gaul and in France, you realize also that there was pretty early on a pretty strong sense of knightly equestrian engineering, right? Even if, let's say, not properly dirigistically pre-planned, but fundamentally deriving from that level of oligarchic and privatistic, essentially elite culture. This is especially self-evident in the case of the Franks. Peoples like the Anglo-Saxons were slightly different in that, and I should have not opened this parenthesis now, because again, we will talk about all of them. But let's say within the continental dimension, let's put it in this way, in the civilized countries, so to say, at this point, the main forces were, yes, the Franks, the Visigoths, the Longobards. The Visigoths are taken out by the Arabs at some point, and yet there were some parts that were namely Gothic still, as you know, in southern France, etc. And still, by the 8th century, the Franks used to tribute some sort of honors to the Gothic and Longobard equestrian skills, because they remembered that back in the day, just a few centuries before, these peoples, say not the Franks, like were much more sort of Western and in the sense come out more like out of the forests of northwestern Germany, as opposed to having been severely impacted by, for example, the Hunnic sort of military culture, zootechnique, and so on, were considered the best horsemen. Right, and there is a terrific evidence of this. I made lots of videos about, especially the Longobard army. We'll come back describing that, because aside from the broader social and political changes that are a bit the most important, also in order to assess the military essence, right, and quality of an army, have, especially from the earlier period, the ones of the first, essentially the first couple of generations after the settlement, strikingly Reitervölker steppes outlook, right? And it's always interesting to be able to give a proper description of these guys' warfare, because they weren't steppes peoples, right? But they look very much like them in terms of individual warriors, like birds with entire horses, with bows, and more. Even though, again, the Germanic peoples, doesn't matter how influenced, say, by the Iranians, by the Turks, were still very discernibly de facto sedentary populations that, yes, had an important military strength in their mounted elite. And even that strength could be varying depending on whether you look at collective training, robustness, or just being very elite. For example, the Gepids were taken out by the Longobards in this sort of across barbaricum and pseudo-civilized reality, talking about what Pannonia was for the Longobards, and in fact also Transylvania for the Gepids to an extent, also along the Danubian Valley, because the Gepids had a very, 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 very rich elite. But in that sense, a too sclerotically oligarchic system with the average sort of final rank freeman, not as affluent as, for example, a Longobard Arimanus that was sort of lived in a much sort of egalitarian system. So that was the Longobard one was also an aristocratically led society, but there were, let's say, more better armed people, for example, than in the Gepid society, and there's nothing structuralistically deterministic about the final outcome of the Longobard victory, but that seemed to have really helped. And by the way, in a context that, as you know, was quite heavily mediated by the Byzantines, witnessed also the arrival of the Avars that actually kicked ass. That, like, the Huns are, at least in a general pop perspective, overrated, and the Avars perhaps underrated. Or maybe we overrate also the Avars in contrast to the Huns, because it's not like they went too far at the end of the day. But again, it's interesting to look at this reality. For example, the Avars, just like the Magyars would infest Merovingian Germany. All right, Germany in this is not much. Also historically later, in a Middle European perspective, a Western European country, but a properly Central European country. You can argue that even if climatologically, geographically, the steppes do not end in Germany, even though, again, the Markfeld is there on the Danube, etc., and that's unsurprisingly also where, as you know, the final showdown in the Nibelungenlied takes place, with the court of Attila, etc., even though the thing most likely took place just on the Middle Rhine back in the day. It was the Huns of Aetius that crushed the Burgundians as opposed to Attila, but it was still, like, in the minds of the Germans, how impacting already at that point. But it really is just a cultural, military cultural sphere on its own. We know also from the Western Slavs that were heavily informed by steppes warfare. Still by the 11th century, it seems that 1/3 of the Polish army was mounted, which doesn't mean that they were heavily armored in larger quantities than the West. Actually, the West had sort of more very elite cavalry, also numerically speaking, but it had also sort of more robust, lesser cavalry and infantry than, for example, these other Eastern peoples really had. So it was a much more robust system by the end of this era. That, again, I decided also to cut at the 10th century, so without including the Normans here, because I think they would really belong to another era. We will talk a bit about them because, of course, as Western Franks, mostly they embodied that magnificent equestrian model that will take over again, like the England, Sicily, the Holy Land, and in general will threaten the existence of the Byzantine Empire and represent just that sort of top-notch advancement, the culmination of all these previous centuries' military development. It's not like, by the way, that like a Norseman of the time of Charlemagne, we're talking about a Milas, like would look dramatically different even from a 13th century one, to be honest. Yes, there are sort of different types of helmets, etc., but the essence, right, of heavy cavalry was somehow the same in material terms. Very different story in collective terms. we shouldn't underestimate the migration era sort of collective training either from the side of the Germans. That, by the way, had a school of excellence also in terms of the Roman cavalry, right, for a long time. So you can't really say that the West had really too much to learn in terms of mounted warfare from the steppes in absolute terms. It's true that the Roman cataphract experiments were pretty much disastrous, but also in the sense that some lighter, more effective cavalry was better in certain cases. The sedentary civilizations kept the steppes peoples successfully out, right? What you see, in fact, in the rest of migration here is basically either de facto sedentary peoples like the Germans who were semi-nomadic in as much as they actually moved across Europe, but during the span of centuries, living again as sedentaries, and peoples like the Huns that basically, vanished at some point as a more consolidated polity, or the Avars, or the Bulgars that fundamentally assimilated, becoming sedentaries, and also, depending on the location, not having too much of a longer story, saying, especially the Avars, the Bulgarians at least, made it themselves as a more cohesive system until the 11th century. But also the Magyars that eventually founded Hungary are the story of peoples that definitely sedentarized, didn't maintain their steppe lifestyle, even though they technically lived in the steppes, because Hungary does have in the Pannonian Basin still that last westernmost chunk of the steppe at hand, populated and constantly replenished. In fact, that's what I was saying about Germany, but also, again, countries like, we've seen it, Hungary in particular, but we've seen it also recently in some videos about Bohemian warfare, Polish warfare. If we're not talking about the Ruthenian one, obviously enough, but a very strong and continuous, over time, steppe influence. All right, think about the Cumans and how they were settled across the centuries, how typical of a figure they are in Upper Hungary, still in Bohemian Germany, even as mercenaries, but still, right, especially from this great catalyst of the steppe of Hungary that maintain also very strong relations with the Western Eurasian steppe, but also the Middle East in many ways, and I discussed this all in my videos about medieval Hungarian warfare. So it's a very big topic. Before I was joking a bit when I said, I came up with the Anglo-Saxons because these Northern European peoples, but let's include the Scandinavians as well, because even though the Anglo-Saxons are technically a Romano-Germanic kingdom of sort, they really were similar in many ways. Again, differences in the High Middle Ages were not radical in absolute terms. Northern Europe is colder for the agricultural system of the time, of course. Had a more fragile economy, less surplus, etc. So these northern cultures, later the Anglo-Danes, in general the Vikings as well, had less of a cavalry development than other peoples. But not much in the sense of technical impediment of sort. If you look at the Vandal era heroes, like, of course, as I was saying before, in the mythology of also the most sort of infantry-based forces. There are mostly, in fact, the Nordics. In Europe, there is this persistent reference to, of course, the cavalry, to the equestrian hero. All right, and this is such a huge meme archetype, etc., that on Schwerpunkt we constantly resume. It's true, we haven't made so many videos about specific units of, for the Anglo-Saxon something, but we have really to talk about Scandinavian warfare, Viking warfare, much more in depth, right? These peoples explain the matter of the Anglo-Saxons, the notion that in theory the Anglo-Saxons did not traditionally fight on horseback, which is a bit of BS, right? Not even a myth. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Of course, the Anglo-Saxons had cavalry. It is true that some of them, even most of them, dismounted before fighting, etc. But there is plenty of evidence of a substantially developed Anglo-Saxon warfare, even just through the Frankish influence itself. There were Normans in England way before William the Conqueror, and we know pretty well that Harold Godwinson had sort of all the, in his military curriculum, had fighting as a Norman in Normandy, on horseback with, the wool ironclad shock tactics, couche, lance, grip, etc., as an Anglo-Dane in England on foot in this broader phalanx, and as a hit-and-run sort of lighter type of cavalryman, of course together with his men, because otherwise he would have always fought more or less as a heavy cavalryman when on horseback in Wales, in the Celtic fringe. As far as the Vikings are concerned, it's pretty much the same, actually. People think that the Norse did not have sort of too much cavalry, but there are instances in which, at least in terms of numbers, we arrive to substantial fractions of the entire forces. The Norse had notoriously some, during their Viking raids, some ships that were specifically designed as horse cargoes, also showing how important cavalry was during the raids in places like, again, France or England, during the 9th to 10th centuries and beyond. So they actually had a substantial amount of cavalry, even a pretty large one, if we want to be honest, as far as the numbers tell us. Again, I will make more precise videos about this. The big difference, of course, compared to the top-notch Frankish cavalry in any, also post-Carolingian context, Western, Eastern Francia, Italic Kingdom, and gradually spreading, in fact, beyond, was collective training, right? Scandinavia did not have a what we sort of conventionally call feudal society. Their system was much less decentralized, was much poorer, telling the truth, and as such, like the possibility even just of putting together bigger amounts of horsemen for a prolonged time, even had it been just for training, right? Think about the Astiludia, would become the tournaments that on the continent were just there from a long time. Also from the migration here, it was really less feasible. In fact, as I was just saying, I don't know if you look at the 6th century, would it have less cavalry among the Germans, the Germanic peoples, the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Danish, the Norse? Again, the Goths, the Longobards tendency had more of that, and the Franks so. There was something in between, but they also developed because of the particular sort of political and social conditions of Roman Gaul, a feudalism based on large estate ownership, the elite sort of system is established, further reinforced by the Merovingians, Clovis, this dynastic system that in fact will surpass in terms of knightly performance eventually the same Goths, the same Longobards down the line, while still tributing them important amounts of honors, because there were some traditions that were still continued. So much of the if you look in my medieval knighthood playlist, there's plenty of this stuff, even just in anthropological terms, the symbol of the horse skull, for example, in places like still, I don't know, in Boccaccio's novels or in even 19th century Scandinavia, etc. It's such a common thing for us Europeans in terms of deep sort of ancestral symbolism that it's not even to be discussed, and in many ways it reflects the continuous awareness of the centrality of mounted warfare and all the requirements for that in a broader societal and cultural fashion throughout all the centuries. So imagine just in the mindset of a Carolingian or late Merovingian, even like given that they had constant international connections with the Saxons, with the Longobards and so on, how shared the symbols actually really were. I really battle against this almost structuralistic, mechanistic concept many people have of military technology that also should have been, by the way, copied by one people to another, because by the way, certain military technology wouldn't just spread because of the local preconditions, and as if, by the way, all the world hadn't been interconnected at the time. I'm literally talking also across oceans. I mean, here we're talking the Vikings as well. So really, it's a bit beyond like a simple answer, but it's also it's actually much more straightforward and less complicated than it seems. Big premise, but forgetting two places that are crucial in any case. The standard harness of this period, let's say, drawing from Carolingian examples of the 9th and the 10th centuries, is pretty straightforward. The harness consisted of a girth, breast straps, and ramp straps, which were commonly employed. So having a general control on the horse, on the saddle, on all the stability of the system that was, as you know, exposed to an incredible stress in combat, but also had to be sort of light as resistant, not to become hampered. We'll not talk about metal armor or caparisons, because this is sort of a very controversial topic. At least, metal armor is something that we don't find much in Europe to begin with until, 12th century Hungarian cases through Byzantine chronicles or something like that. As you know, they mostly start appearing from the later 13th century. In other ways, caparisons and some sort of kilted protection, etc., would have been more around there from quite a time. If anything, chamfrons would have been used, but we don't see too many of them. And again, we don't have to commit the mistake of presuming that the effectiveness of cavalry is simply a matter of defensive gear. It really lays first and foremost in collective training. We've seen it countless times. It's just the notion, but if you have lots of archers, you can't take cavalry down because it doesn't have armor. Missile warfare does not do that, right? The heavy cavalryman has always the upper hand, and it steamrolls anybody who stands in the way, if it stands. So the lighter horsemen can get the hell out of the way, and the infantrymen have to prepare to a pretty impactful charge. Besides, it's crucial to realize that essentially from the mid-6th century, cavalry, also in the West, has gained the upper hand over infantry, which doesn't mean that infantry wouldn't be able to defeat cavalry. There are examples of this era, such as the Battle of Zuntel. I mean, at the end of the period, even, the Anglo-Danish stand at the Battle of Hastings is really impressive in some ways. And there will be, in fact, sort of scattered infantry victories here and there against cavalry in the following generations. Sometimes we're talking dismounted knights themselves, telling the truth, so that's also a bit like the elephant in the room, because we're not really talking about a period where even the less stratified societies fighting for independence, like the Saxons, say, would be so particularly military performing. You have the Battle of Zuntel. That is actually a case where you see these untrained Rhenish levies of the Franks that are cut to pieces by a sort of strong, determined, well-positioned Saxon infantry, which is also one of the few Carolingian defeats and possibly the only tactically reconstructible battle of the entire Carolingian era, given the level of documentation. But there are relative exceptions, or at least they reflect the normal proportion of sort of cavalry infantry. Cavalry, however, had gotten the upper hand. Again, it's not decisive, as crushingly decisive as it would become, especially from the third quarter of the 12th century until essentially the early 14th century, where no infantry basically is able to defeat cavalry at that point in open field. Unless in the French, but where, in fact, cavalry contingents were smaller and sort of terrain was more dominant. That's another story. But in conventional sort of Western European warfare, you don't find that. But again, cavalry wins more often than not at this point, and it's really become something and might be reckoned with compared to also previous era. I made videos about the stirrup spread, horseshoeing, etc. So cavalry becomes ever more crushing. That's the direction. It's the same, thought with stirrup. It's not the stirrup made. I've been asked this repeatedly. Again, do you need the stirrup to have heavily crushing cavalry? No, you need heavy crushing cavalry in order for the cavalrymen to need a stirrup, which is a completely different story. That is to say, the stirrup does not spread because somebody had invented it. It spreads because heavy cavalry becomes stronger and needs this increasing means of stability. Without mentioning, there is yet another factor that I think is very underrated in the history of warfare and can be beautifully studied also through, in fact, the history of mounted combat through the steppes, and not only. That is to say, the level of heroism, say, of individualistic warriorism and athleticism, champion profile of the knight, it's something that deteriorates over time. Since we are dirty materialists / technologists, we think that, the peak of knightly warfare is, say, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th century, just because armor became heavier, right? That's absolutely not the case. In that sense, the technology is more like an auxilium for things that before knights did just with their bare physicality, right? The thighs of, a 4th century Italic horseman would have been something like steel. And just in a time where, again, in ancient warfare, there were just hippo sandals, there wasn't even in the sense of proper horseshoeing, whatever, but as we know also from the Macedons, etc., like cavalries charged the hell, smashing people to pieces, and in ways that you would have not really wanted to observe. Just from the steppes at some point there was the model of the double function of the shock element as a cataphract and as an archer as well. This lives especially in the Arsacid Parthian tradition, and even the Sasanians, that are more tributed for their cataphract stuff in general, because they're a more complex army, actually had abandoned that model, hence split the shock element with from the horse archery one, with, again, a more collectively functional system, but also less individually performing one. All right, so again, never underestimate how, even in their relative disorder and lack of cohesion during the migration era, Germanic warriors were in terms of equestrian capacity from an individual point of view. And we know it fairly well. Again, we will make surely more videos on this topic from the Medieval Knighthood series. Today we talk about, say, the horse and the horse harness just in general, and looking at different peoples at the same time. Besides, you find all the color and the folklore, if you want, that you can imagine. Decorative bells and ornaments were frequently attached to the saddle. This was typical among the Visigoths, the Franks, the Saxons, the Scandinavians, the Slavs as well. And this is all stuff we see in the steppes. We've seen it for the Turks, for the Mongols. Basically, these bells reverberate the cosmic harmony, right? The idea is that the wind, the ether, was the vessel of the same imperium, and this randomness also in the agitation movement of the horse, which was sacred. It was a typically dual symbol, like one that belonged to the dirt, to blood, to the chthonic dimension. Think about how it was an animal sacred to Poseidon, is a chthonic deity, but also how it could literally lead the divinized hero to heaven from this etheric cavalcades across the battlefields of Europe. I mean, think about, what the visions that the unfortunate legionnaires at the Battle of Adrianople, when looking at this, Ostrogothic Iranian horsemen, knights like with wings, with this aura, would have really looked like. Imagine all these federati as well in the lower infantry aspect, knowing of these force to be unleashed from the steppe. And all the cosmic power was really contained in that. I mean, even with darker force. I mean, think about the Huns, from which those same guys were actually fleeing in the moment. And so it's a pretty frenetically, also trance-inducing, shamanic kind of deal at some level, that you read it for the Germans in Tacitus. This mostly depends refers to the fringe, to the chthonic dimension. In fact, like the Huns, the Turks in general were a step below the Indo-Aryans historically in the way they had manifested their type of knighthood compared to what would be the Turco-Mongol one later on. But they resonate deeply at so many levels of also, think about the Alan epopee, right? Serving both the Roman and the Chinese imperial bodyguards, up to also the Mongol era. We talk about the islands and their big dimension. In that case, great individual champions, but broken by bigger peoples, and having this diaspora that left also traces in different parts of Europe. If you look still today at France, Portugal, even as west as that, so made some videos about them, but it's always important to remember from which kind of hellish context they were really coming from. In all this, we are partially, again, ignoring the already importantly developed equestrian tradition existing in the West, in Europe, from the Roman, but also the Hellenistic tradition. I made a video at some point explaining how we have this incredibly silly myth concerning the alleged sort of low quality of Roman cavalry that instead was truly after the Macedonian, an incredibly powerful force. When we talk properly about the full-blooded Roman citizenry cavalry, not eventually the auxiliaries taken also from the rest of Europe. It's the same thing for the Celts, right? They were obsessed with horses, the Gauls in particular, but they didn't have enough collective cohesion, right? So they could be individual, good individual warriors. They sold their services as mercenaries, as auxiliaries, whatever you want to call them. But the capacity of actually fighting and winning as a cohesive force is a completely different story. The Romans had better cavalry, even than the Carthaginian was, better cavalry commanders than that. So never underestimate how propulsively and impactfully traumatic even just European sedentary cavalry have historically been. It's not just the steppe, right, nor the East, right? There is actually a very scarce influence of the East intended as the Middle East, as the Levant, on the development of what we exquisitely understand as Western European cavalry. And again, there was the phase in which everything was imported from the East. From the Crusades, no, the Europeans took everything, the trebuchet, the cavalry tactics. But I studied these things as a PhD in medieval warfare, specializing in tactics, especially at the peak of the great medieval civilization for, at this point, more than a decade. And I've never actually found any actual connection with that. If anything, I found the opposite. And I found actually a bigger deal of equestrian cavalry. Well, of course, at the time of the Crusades, because Europeans were more feudal than the Byzantines or the Arabs. But sometimes also in a strictly technical sense. I mean, the war horses breeds, brought up by the Cistercian Grange or the Christian war horses of their conquista were as performing as the ones of their Islamic opponents, and actually could chase the lighter ones as well, which is a myth. Again, the lighter one cannot be chased. It is true that, again, in fact, especially if you're heavier, you don't really need to chase a lighter one in a collective sense, because you can't simply walk through. But we know since antiquity that, say, the Celtiberian horsemen were actually more performing than the Numidian ones, and that at some point the same Numidian kings, again, they were very skillfully equestrian peoples in their own regard, hired Celtiberian bodyguards on horseback on their own account. So, and there is this weird tendency to always belittle everything Westerner, that at some point, especially from, I would say, the 1970s, the 1980s, in part as, Marxistic influence and or the spread of this sort of post-Vietnam series, post-Vietnam war trauma of some sort, wanted to render everything sort of emasculated, all technical, all technological, scared of hand-to-hand combat, while military history presents you with this massive slap in the face. In fact, the bloody consistency of what was the only purpose, especially of cavalry. Cavalry cannot defend. By definition, the only way for cavalry to defend is to dismount it, becoming infantry. The sole purpose of cavalry is reducing to pulp and breaking the bones of everything is in front of you, right? And cavalry clashes like crazy, right? The notion that, again, cavalry sort of avoids smashing frontal into ask the veterans of the Battle of Austerlitz, when the French and the Russian cuirassiers clashed one another, they heard from kilometers away the noise of the bodies of the armor impacting into one another. They were conceived exclusively for frontally smashing into an enemy without any kind of diversion whatsoever, because that's the only way you can achieve strategic and tactical superiority. All right, and the actual horses, also just as people, as any other animal, are selected on that basis. There are some horses, there are some stallions that are less sort of loaded for psychological or hormonal reasons intertwined. Some horses will literally smash into the fences and break their own bones because they are angry, they want to smash, they want to do that. The horse, by the way, bites, kicks, really incompetent strength for doing that, and you will select that just as you would select the men of the time by social status, political affiliation, but in this sense, eugenetic breeding for being capable of smashing at 45 kilometers per hour against other knights that smash at 45 kilometers per hour. It's as if you were trained to basically take 90 kilometers per hour hits. Of course, you wouldn't hopefully literally get that because the enemy formation would at that point crumble under some greater sort of force crashing to, but somebody was smashing to that, and you could be that one. And you were especially tested at the beginning, like in the moment in which you became a knight, exactly to do that, right? Just like, the youth in infantry-based army in antiquity was sent out there skirmishing and exposing themselves to the enemy like that. Exactly to see if you were fit, primarily from a psychological point of view, aside from the striking athleticism that it takes to be a knight, for horse riding for military purpose. That is something that we can't technically replicate today, especially for the times beings for the needs of his time, and that otherwise would have not been good at it. Right? If you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to risk on that, and habitually, eventually starting to chop to pieces human beings as soon as it follows, like crazy, you cannot be a leader. You cannot be entrusted with the control of a society or a community. It doesn't work. All right, and this is exactly what is being engineered at this point. And of course, it's not like other peoples are not. That impacting in other ways. But the West does seem to have, in fact, engineered from these very centuries something that eventually overwhelmed, from a military point of view, all the rest. There's definitely a lot of similarity, for example, with Islamic warfare. Right? The Arabs had their own view of chivalry. It was more connected with the concept of youth. Besides, since the early Islamic times, you can argue that Turkic ghulams were already there at some point, regardless of the slightly later takeover. So, the Turks from Central Asia were much more of an equestrian people than the Arabs. But in general, when, for example, we described the embellishments of the horses, the adornments, again, the belts, etc., the Arabs had pretty much the same. The Mediterranean was there. The Goths, the Franks, the Longobards came at different times. The Byzantines themselves in contact with these peoples that in turn again had themselves received a hell of, as we've seen, Central Asian influence in a way or in another. We don't have to wait for the Turks. The Arabs had been heavily informed by Sasanian warfare that, as we explained, was pretty dramatically equestrian centered to an important degree, and that would always, in fact, remain like a heavily Persian mark of much of the military developments around, especially the Middle East. And, we made lots of videos about the Seljuk Turks, about Mongols. There is always like a very deep blending of all this stuff. Just for saying that it's obviously not a closed system, but it's also not just everybody copying from one another. It's mostly like local structures of government political and societal organization that make the armies as we know. Again, I made multiple, for example, armies organizations video for the Franks, for the Longobards, for the Visigoths, for the Anglo-Saxons, etc. So we will pass more also to others at some point. We talked about specific cavalry units for the Byzantines, for others. So we're really getting there, like to the degree of, especially of content created, dedicated to this specific topic. At the start of our period, stirrups, which were worn short, were not yet in widespread use. All right, they seemingly became widely adopted in Europe by the late 8th century, and among the Arabs themselves by the late 7th. Right, as you know, and we discussed this in a video about the spread of the stirrup. The Avars seem to have had an important role, and so a steppe people, not much like Islam or some Persian influence tradition, whatever, that informed very much like both the Frankish and the Byzantine warfare. The same goes for the Longobards. And this is sort of all very well archaeologically documented. And again, most of the need for the stirrup was some sort of stability. We find even children's graves with stirrups, like that's I don't know, in the early Longobard era, for example. The need for an increased stability for collectively smashing into the enemy is something that gradually takes place, that is starting to be more concentratedly engineered in the Carolingian era, hence the late 8th century. But you know that even on the Bayeux tapestry at the end of the 11th, the beginning of the 12th century, some Norman knights still don't wear stirrups, right? And you stay on horseback with your thighs, even during impact. Naturally, things were acceleratingly changing that, but up to that point, like in the centuries that we're describing now, it's your thighs that will do that, right? We have beautiful passages from Paul the Deacon, for example, about the Longobard king Authary, really showing the Bavarians how he would stand on his horse without stirrup, right? Or we think so, because again, there is a debate also about how much, because we have metal stirrups archaeologically documented. What about the organic ones? It would have been, right? And we think that, I don't know, certain steps people for using the contest in shock tactics, etc., had, some sort of very, without stirrups, as far as we know, some system of straps tying them to the horse, whatever. And this Longobard king raises on top of the horse and hits a tree with his throwing axe, revealing himself, by the way, in that moment on the Alps. But there is all that context we will not going to digress on, showing what would have been a typical feat of a Germanic nobleman at the time, right? Being able to strike an enemy with precision with a throwing axe from horseback, right? Which, requires all that kind of physicality, because you need really to rise on the horse in order to fully put emotion, also all your back muscles or your arms once, etc. This was really typical and primitive, surely, but very, very individualistically, warrioristically sort of kind of focused. Later, things would really evolve, but not really in function of a more effective collective performance, but not because the individual training had really ceased, right, to develop. Besides, again, there is more, even in the aforementioned increase of panoply, there is a level of physical sustainability. I mean, armor becomes heavier, same goes for arms, side weapons, and so on. So it's always an enormous challenge. Now, the saddle constructed from wood and leather was normally low in profile. Again, as we will see now, there were some changes, but was already evolving into essentially what you see in the Bayeux Tapestry 1, right, where you see this big archons right at the front and the rear, specifically designed for that, we can't even say new form of shock, but say enhanced form of shock combat was beginning to evolve towards in fact, the end of this period, preventing the rider from being pushed from his saddle by the shock impact. We have some Islamic sources from Spain telling us that the Reconquista knights literally chained themselves to the saddles not to be literally catapulted away from the horse when this smashing into the enemy. Right. Consider that in this later context, again, Norman, sort of Western Frankish context, the archons could be dangerous for the same rider. In fact, the same William of Normandy himself died of some gradual sort of internal injuries inflicted by being thrown forward on the front archon of his saddle. And so it seems reasonable to assume that his accident was in no way unique, right? Leaving and dying on horseback, by all means, was very, very dangerous and very risky to begin with. And so there is all an evolution toward that direction. Mostly with, again, these raised sections at both the front and rear, which you understand quite straightforwardly physically prevent you from basically falling, especially from, back and ahead. So not much like side movement, but literally the ones entailed by frontal impacting into someone or something, right? There are, however, some middle grounds. For example, we know this from different illustrations. There is, after all, not such a scarce iconography. This all in between, like the gradual introduction of stirrups. Again, some, depending on whether, again, there are different hypotheses regarding the spread, especially of organic stirrups, but let's say mostly from our times also in at the very beginning of our period, we're more or less there, already there actually, but in some parts of Europe before, you can argue the introduction of stirrups. And so relatively independently from this, there is an early model featuring wooden saddle boards with a high pommel but a low cantle. This was prevalent in regions influenced by Byzantine culture, mostly because the Byzantines preferred some sort of kind of more equilibristic stunts, training, some slightly lighter type of horsemen compared to what would gradually affirm itself in the West, because the Byzantines have this tendency of being very much influenced by steppe warfare as well, and also by this sort of broader Eastern concept that would see like an elite, also numerically armored cavalry and sort of lighter skirmishers. The West has a sort of more generalized heavy cavalry. And so this type of high pommel but low cantle was mostly for remaining on horseback, but while still allowing mobility, mounting, dismounting, making all kind of stunts on saddle. As we'll see, historically, everybody had been able to make the stunts also before the widespread of the saddle, etc. But here again, in fact, warfare was tendentially getting a bit more elite as far as cavalry was concerned, so tendentially better organized, sort of regardless of the general shrinking of, say, manpower, labor force at the end of the migration year. A saddle with a wooden frame, so a more robust sort of box, so to say, was brought to Europe by the Avars from the steppes. And the Arabs from the Middle East, getting some of that Persian feudal influence as well. So you see there are different avenues, mostly again for North Africa, the Mediterranean, etc. It's mostly the Arabs, but for continental Europe, the northern shores of the Mediterranean, it's mostly these previous also Roman models, that's also in North Africa for that matter, that spread, however, under some greater Avar influence. except for Spain. Spain, in a continental sense, was more Arab influence eventually, just because it was taken over by the Arabs as well. But not only. In fact, there is an aspect about Iberian warfare that we'll see a bit later as well, that we tend to, again, always to exoticize, in a sense, without realizing that it was a very distinctively Iberian one from millennia. The idea that the so-called fighting a la Jineta would have been some kind of Arab legacy of the Kara al-Far back and forth hit and run tactics. Now, there is no doubt that the Arabs fought like that too, but actually the Iberians fought like that from ever, right? They had always had that sort of lighter bias compared to, I don't know, places like Gaul or Italy, and we know this pretty well since the times of Scipio, and it's something inherent. I can't speak geography. It's also some, in fact, influence from other military cultures, also in North Africa, etc. That is at most reinforced, but was not really invented. Was imported by the Arabs in the peninsula as something innovative. The Visigoths had pretty good sort of alla Jineta fighters as well before that. Then you have a more refined version of the fully wood-frame saddle from Central Europe between the 9th to 10th century, possibly introduced by the Magyars. That's a theater we will analyze now because, again, the Eastern Franks have to mostly cope with these guys that will arrive until Spain. They ravaged Gaul, Italy as well, but mostly hit hard in Germany. And you have a bit more of this kind of wood-frame saddle, which... Again, we're talking fairly simple material pieces, after all. This doesn't, for example, translate to some sort of more refinedly knightly culture in Germany that historically remains behind compared to Western Frankish developments until basically the 12th or 13th century. It's mostly the design that we look at, and as we explained just now, the Magyars, as a sort of broadly speaking Eastern people, had the same sort of step pattern. Very good elite that is very heavy, in some cases heavier than, in fact, the same Western normal heavy, sort of miles, but also much lighter horsemen, right? So they combined that in ways that would render this more developed saddles, for example, the product of some sort of elite, more individualistic champion that, however, still fought in less sophisticated, collectively organized systems. Like, for example, already the Frankish one. I made a video about the Battle of Riade that explains how William the Fowler was able to defeat the Magyars, and that these weren't really sort of more advanced as a military system than the Westerners, and it was mostly just like the Westerners enabling their passage for exquisite political reasons rather than some sort of big military system as we would intended. It's a bit like, I don't know, for example, I have a video incoming on Slavic warfare, or actually Ruthenian warfare more specifically, and during more or less the same era. And we've seen how in the later period, the Kievan knights that imported a big deal of arms and armor from the West, and had more of, in this sense, of a Western and Turkic influence than a Byzantine one, regardless of what iconic, in fact, iconography, so to say, art tells us, were actually superior in individual terms, considering their equipment, its variety. It's still that sense of you can't be both a shock and then missile trooper, because equally they were a slightly more primitive system, and they thus had a lot of emphasis placed on the prince, on the champion, etc., or the druzhina, while having sort of lighter troops a bit all around, and so maintaining that kind of championship. So this sort of great evolution of saddles in the steppes is out there because the elite represented itself, and we know of that, but it's not like a widespread saddle in these armies, because most of the troops would use a very few, actually, sometimes not even a saddle, as horse archers. Whereas in the West, more or less, the miles is a miles, of the same class, especially from the 10th century. There's a military class that basically is recognizable all across post-Carolingian Europe that is that straightforwardly heavy, but in fact not ultra-championly heavy, if not for some very, top elite bodyguard units, because what they cared about was mostly collective training, and they had enough numbers, because the West was more affluent, had more surplus, and more resources for training this guy collectively to be effective as collective guys. It's a bit like saying, why did the night ended and, pike and shot warfare increased? Because, it's not like a pikeman or arquebusiers are more advanced fighters than a knight, right? But combined, and in larger numbers, they overcome him, right? So you know what the trend is, and we understand that. In any case, by the 9th century, certain sources already occasionally depict saddles with pronounced archons or arsons, resembling those of later medieval designs, the Norman ones that we were talking about before, an early iteration of the wood-framed, in fact, so-called knight saddle, which would become widespread across Europe for the remainder of the medieval era. So we're in the 9th century. Right, so we're talking mostly late Carolingian era, and the thing prototypically was basically there already. Besides, if we look throughout the entire period, saddle clothes were also a thing. They were generally the same size as or smaller than the saddle itself, as they are, by the way, seldom visible in contemporary records. Is another important piece of the wall. Speaking of horse breeds, again, universe, we'll have to condense this in a few punching lines, because it's a very complicated topic, telling the truth. I even have a lot of content ready on this that I hope to share with you quite soon, together with lots of other interesting topics. For example, in Western warfare, horse archery was actually pretty much out there, not as the first option, as you know, but more widespread than we think on a regular basis. Also from antiquity, telling the truth. In any case, again, speaking of the animals, the most esteemed war horses were obviously stallions, right? Because they were, again, angrier, cockier, and they wanted to smash more stuff. And again, just like what nobility was considered to be like at a human level. Mares, however, were frequently ridden because, of course, costing less, they were in a sense more affordable. And again, some of these ladies were pretty good at that as well. Some great leaders used to ride them as well. Some of the more refined breeds, as you know, as for example William the Conqueror's own mount, were Arab, meaning that they came also from North Africa, and so there were all different. Spanish horses were also notoriously prized, etc. So there is all a geography and economy, right? Literally of horse breeding across Europe, the Mediterranean, Western Eurasia, that at some point we will track more properly. You can imagine how much experimentation and wisdom behind this horse breeding really relate. Think about the great, the massive demanial estates of the Carolingian era. Think about the later even monastic grounds that served as pastures at some point for these war horses. There are sort of ups and downs. The 10th century is a moment of great contraction, but at the same time you have more Magyar horses around. So there's always some influence, some external element that colors the wall in more concrete terms. And we know that war horses were, again, traded from very far away. Charlemagne at some point gifted Al-Mamun with war horses, for example, to Baghdad. All right, so especially the Frankish world was becoming, also as far as arms and armor production, the very military center of Europe at this point. You know that also as far as metallurgy was concerned, like this shifted from ancient times from Noricum, more or less today's Austria, to the Middle Rhine, right? So with a greater Frankish control. all different, again, wisdoms, technologies like hidden, like unfortunately lost in the practical execution of their craftsmanship, to legends, to myths, to some very important pieces of literature at times are beautiful to interpret. And of course today we can create something much more advanced, but the way they were able to do that at the time with their own means is irreplicable by us in the same way, right? So that's really humbling and makes you think. Naturally, when we talk about horsemanship, we have to open those enormous parentheses that I already did, if anything, at the beginning of those videos about medieval tournaments regarding equestrian training, right? Military practice on horseback, that it's something so old you can't really even track an origin of, if not with one of the creation of cavalry, or even before chariot warfare. And so there is scattered evidence here and there. We know of games that the Romans had to pick up gymnasia. Later, we know during the migration era, the Longobirds playing this ritual initiatory game as well, thrusting with the tip of their lance on horseback a viper's skin, which symbolizes the dragon of the Norse mythology, Siegfried, and so this initiation rite, while running on horseback and eventually eating collectively this viper's skin, strengthening that sort of regeneration, chthonic wisdom that is crushed and sort of regenerated, transfigured within the achieving, the augmenting hero. This is well symbolized by all the iconography of St. George that, as we've seen, actually stems from the 3rd century BC in fully fledged iconographic, artistically documentable fashion. Made an entire video on the riders slaying the dragon, the serpent, and this again was already pretty old and pretty European also in that sense, because also, regardless of steppes' influence, at that point the steppes were dominated by the Indo-Aryans. So we're not really looking at particularly different peoples in, for example, ethno-linguistical sense across, and also especially considering this archetypal meanings and symbolism. There would be all kind of games of forms of training that we can, in some cases, just speculate on, but others we know, we can imagine, for example, in a Longobard context. But during the Carolingian era, so where the Franks had already taken over Italy, the local Gastalds still being sort of active as some sort of commanders of picked forces sent also by the Carolingians here and there across the empire to tame this or that rebellion, practicing this typical games with their retainers that would maintain, sort of hold the horse's leather bridle, and while their masters literally leaped onto horse while fully armored, which was considered like an important stunt that was just an important way of remaining psychophysically active and fit and feeling your body and being able to pull off this this feat together with the other ones that on horseback would have functioned. By the way, there is a very heavy sense of feudalism in all this. Even during the Gothic War, when the Longobards sent some troops from Pannonia to Narses, we're told that they had retainers, that these were the same men who helped them dressing up, because they were very heavy at some point already in a de facto knightly direction. They would hand them, say, their shield. They would, because you must stay on horse. You would wait, for example, before battle in certain circumstances, dismounted, not to fatigue the horse necessarily, but at some point you had to stay on horseback ready, and at least you would wait for picking up the shield or wearing the helmet or something like that. The ability to mount a warhorse without stirrups or assistance was a critical skill for any cavalryman. It could really save your life in different times in history, I think about much later times what happened to Philip IV of France at the Battle of Montpavel, when one of his knights literally kneeled to make him jump on horseback while a Flemish infantryman cut off his head, and the king was able to safely run away. And so this, again, military equestrian skills were always, naturally, in full panoply. We even have, I think, we have the armor of Philip IV for the Battle of Montpavel that tells us how dramatic this entire setting really was, and all the things that could really happen to you. Remember what we said before about the shape of Byzantine, or the Byzantine saddle, or remember what we said before, like, for example, the importance of jumping on horseback is evidently much greater in the earlier period. With the arçon, basically you have to have mantled on the horseback remain there, and if you're taken down, you're pretty much blipped up in a sense, and or at least, of course, you will try to raise again if you haven't, either your legs or your spine or your neck broken. And even a rib broken is not very pleasant, really, or an arm even. But the point is that you entered on horseback, like as we've seen, even anchored literally to the saddle, in between the arçons, and you had to end the battle like that. Hopefully, if that didn't happen, it was quite of a problem. This thing sort of increased in evidence, especially in the later medieval period, when at least the ultra heavy elite knight was a much bigger thing that could, in a sense, barely move. This is, as you know, not really true, because dismounting was always a thing in different circumstances, and required, again, a shocking level of athleticism. We know of, Marshal Boucicaut making literal stunts, caramboles on full armor. At his time, like, was still that mix of plate and mail, but let's say it was heavy. Right, so it is true that, of course, armor was made to fully move anatomically, ergonomically, and so on. But it was also very extenuating to be behind a certain limit to operate in it. And especially if you were traumatized with adrenaline exploding you, especially if you couldn't hold your nerves and you had been shocked by, being thrown to the ground, having fallen from horse. After the enemy impacted you, etc. Like, it really added to the general drama and the general psychophysical difficulty of it all. And we do know, yes, that there were, in spite of this all, in fact, still knights. This would have happened also with lighter armor before, that once thrown off from horse would have not been able to rise up on their feet, because they were veritably psychophysically exhausted. There were people who died on the spot by themselves at some point because they were exhausted. They had a syncope, or they were so dehydrated in combat they literally died in the moment while standing. And so imagine what we're actually discussing. This is not just about technology, technique, whatever. It's a much bigger picture. Now, we can analyze certain areas, certain regions, theaters, etc., and draw some sort of stereotypical picture of various knights. So, for example, warriors from northern Spain, especially after the Islamic Andalusian neighbors had taken over almost the entirety of the peninsula. We're during the Reconquista already. I have a video accounting on that, for that matter. Would have been heavily influenced by those same Muslim Arab style, right? For example, some of them adopted the leather loop stirrup, which was sort of looser. We find even, for example, like some barefooted knights at some point, like lighter troops, generally speaking, because again, the Iberian Peninsula has tendentially lighter troops on average. Because especially the Islamic part was much less of a feudal system, and the north also was more primitive, even though it was very influenced by the Franks, receives subsidy by the papacy, etc., took a while before it could fully engineer fully-fledged feudalism. And this is really normal because basically any other country outside of northern France in many ways had to gap that distance with this region at a point. But you know that the Franks were already there from quite a while. Think about Roncesvalles. I made some videos about the origins of Navarre that in part explain this, but also many other videos about Reconquista warfare that explain this a bit. And so we can imagine some leather and wood stirrup at some point, organic, so that are difficult to archaeologically track, but that would surely been there, probably from earlier times. There are some scholars that think that already, I don't know, in the 4th, in the 5th century BC, the Romans used some sort of kind of leather stirrup. It's really possible, really plausible. Think about those Alan bodyguards in the service of some Arian emperor. They historically could have worn something like that, especially if they were of the sort of old cataphract type, and again needed a lot of safety, security system to remain on horseback during impact, wielding their massive contest that at some point the Goths themselves wield as they are intermingled with the same Iranians. The 10th century is really crucial because by this point a veritable military class, as a consequence of the full development of the vassalic beneficiary system within the Carolingian Empire, creates a pan-Western European professional soldiery, the milites, that are really knights, right? You can't argue that, I don't know, even the Hirdr, the Huskars in that sense were something like that, yes, but they were much less organically and systemically and collectively mounted in a typical military scenario compared to the broader Frankish world, right? So this is really something else, right? And most of them had embraced the stirrup and frame saddle, right? At least there is a debate, especially regarding the stirrup, and perhaps too much has been written about it. It's not even so important. It's like the couché lance technique, something that had not yet been developed, but actually had always been used. I mean, the couché lance can be used by anyone, who kept being used also in later times, overarm, underarm, thrown, whatever. Throughout every single time in history, cavalrymen has used the lance in the same possible way, preferentially. I mean, obviously in a more or less preferential way throughout the different eras. There is no doubt that the couché lance became much more effective later. But let's say cavalrymen always did everything with the lance. So there is not a standard grip or a standard way of going with that. Just think about, I don't know, the Norman knights at Hastings before, like sort of throwing javelins even before smashing to the enemy lines just per se. And that entails, by the way, that you're light enough just even for the heavier cavalry not to simply just specialize into the charge only, or at least the heavier Normans would have actually done that, but still there were some relatively heavy militaries that could and would do that. We've seen them at work also at Durakion a few decades later. So basically the same thing. It's like an Epee Road Hastings, right? And how impacting and smashing they were against Byzantine troops. Lances, by the way, during the 10th century still bore the typical sort of wings or lugs below the blade, suggesting, in fact, a combat style centered on thrusting and parrying at the same time. So there wasn't just like the fully sort of collective charge where it's just the formation that matters. There was a lot of more individual scattered fights throughout the clashes. That would be because the punch was not as resolutive as the melee, right? And so that's mainly the reason. Again, let's not overly categorize, but tendentially that's the dynamic. Male hauberks split at the sides rather than the front to the back indicated that these soldiers were equally adept at fighting on foot as on horseback, because they needed, as we've seen, to often mount and dismount still. Again, typically we've seen it also in battles of the 12th century, Burke to Ruled, etc. That kind of still Hastings, kind of all Anglo-Norman context. in Western Frankish one it was also the most advanced of knightly collective knightly mounted combat, was still characterized by a lot of dismounting, right? At this point, for example, in this still largely forested and swampy Germany, even imperial forces would often dismount, receiving the enemy while having horses, like behind streams, etc., because terrain, to some extent, was facilitated still, like what essentially that would be reflected in a societal sense, right? The Eastern Frankish system had to be yet fully feudalized, and so to a degree, cavalry was weaker compared to infantry, compared especially to Western France. We could have, and so of course the splits at the sides rather in front of the back meant that you had to turn more, you had to move more with your legs, walking, fighting on foot, rather than just sitting nicely on horseback, right? This is a very important indicator, apologically speaking. Notable would have been the iron prick-spurs adorned with gilt decoration, worn over leather shoes. These were especially like a distinction, right, of honor. The golden spurs historically would be even the prize from the victorious knights at tournaments. And so this kind of wealth was already expressed, like also during the migration here, that was the touch of steppe exhibitionism with this Spangenhelm and encrusted in precious metals, etc., because in some ways they were treasures it was better bringing with you on campaign than living at home. Horses, the horse harnesses featured a knotted design, possibly for adjustment purposes. This is frequently depicted in sources spanning various regions and time periods. There are different regional contexts. For example, Italy, at some point after the partitions of the Carolingian Empire, relied primarily on its own military forces to cope with both the Muslims and the Magyars. We mentioned before the Gastaldi in the Longobard army that still also in Carolingian times had maintained that historical terminology. And again, if you're interested in the Longobard army, also in Italic warfare, so intended properly from the Italic kingdom, from Carolingian times between the 9th and 10th, the 11th century, I made some videos about these and we'll keep talking about them, had maintained their aristocratic military lifestyle, descending again from the Longobard tradition. And so even if the Longobards had been living since their arrival in Italy in a much more civilized, urbanized, literate context, they had somehow gentrified more than the Franks, who were really very primitive and brutal. But mostly also having a very different society. It was much more feudal than the Longobard one. It was much more egalitarian, also in Italy, because there the latifundia had been somehow parceled out after the Gothic War. Not much by the Longobards, but already by how the system of the elites had collapsed before that. They had historically less collective training than the Franks. They were a bit the exception. Again, the Longobards would have had some sort of pretty basic European, especially Western European standard cavalry force. At some point, the Franks and the Longobards were the last sort of Western true powers, recognizable out there. There's often the idea the Longobards had bad cavalry because the Franks beat them. But the Franks were superior to everybody. The Longobards probably had pretty average and standard and good enough cavalry by any standard, right? And again, they didn't even look that different from one another. They probably also had the same identical arms and armor, even though we don't have such an overwhelmingly amount of archaeological evidence. For example, the famed Brunia studded armor is archaeologically very scarcely documented, but we know it was there through different indicators. We know that there were still some scale armor, especially the Germans and the Italians, because of their exposure to, again, a bit more like the steppes, the Byzantines, maintained that for sort of substantially late in time, historically, in the 12th, 13th century. So that's how west, actually the east arrived to a certain extent. For example, for the Longobards, we know that just like any other people at the time would have had some sort of chainmail, but archaeologically we don't find too much because, again, they didn't, by the time they were taken over by the Carolingians, they didn't bury their dead in their men, their warriors in arms for Christian reasons. And so at this point we have just the Alamanni that are barely Christianized yet that still bury, in fact, their dead with arms and iron. That's kind of it's mostly like 1 century later than the Saint Franks, the Burgundians, the Longobards, etc. So it's quite fascinating because in turn they were somehow also relatively Frankish influenced. They were not much like the Saxons that we know, by the way, still buried. We're talking the old Saxon, the continental Saxons. They're dead with horses. There are aristocracy. You know that the horse, Hengist, and horse also at the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasion was a prominent symbol. Still today, figuring on the coat of arms of many northern German, both North Sea and Baltic countries, is a symbol of Saxony in many ways. So it's that old. And again, it's not like the Saxons had particularly large or robust cavalry forces as far as we know, but still, again, archetypally, the meaning was there. If we were to represent a stereotypical southern Italian miles, say a Longobard one of Salerno or Benevent, he would have probably used, at least among the others, a slightly curved sword, right, more sort of like chopping Mediterranean influence, a kite-shaped shield, a decorative horse collar, like we're talking the later, like in the 10th century, all of which actually reflect Byzantine influences, in this case from, in fact, southern Italy, given that the Byzantines were still there, right? Do we want to look at, I don't know, in between West and East Francia, Lotharingia, right, a Lotharingian knight of the late 10th century. Lotharingia had a hell of a chivalric tradition. This is the land of the Arturian, at least where Wagner settled, as you know, the Arturian Legion, Brabant, at the time of Henry the Fowler with Lohengrin and so on. And we can say that this Western European milas, because Lotharingia is somehow, in fact, more like a Western than a Central European thing, was nearly identical to the warriors who achieved victory at the Battle of Hastings. Like, not much would actually change from the late 10th century to that Norman epopee, or to which also Lotharingian knights participated, as you know, from Flanders. It also participated in the First Crusade later on. It looked, again, pretty darn similar. Here we don't even talk about the Basques or the Bretons that had sort of more hit-and-run cavalry tactics, like, I don't know, the Welsh as well, even though those were sort of more foot-based. There were lots of different historical traditions that, again, were somehow very old, even though the future in Western Europe was this heavy cavalry that we mostly just illustrated. Speaking of Northern Europe, peoples like the Scandinavians likely adopted stirrups through contact with the Magyars, or possibly, of course, the earlier Avars, or if we think about organic ones, even the Huns. If we speak of Central Eastern Europe, it's said that Attila required some tribute, even as far as the Suiones, as far as Scandinavia itself was concerned, across the Baltic. This is quite fascinating, because you really can locate Northern Europe a bit into this broader fringe, right, that extends in the west as a crescent, like up to the same Britain, the Anglo-Saxon Britain, that is, yet again, a more like Western system, a Romano-Germanic Christian one, but militarily speaking, and socially and culturally, is also very similar and tied to Northern Europe, that in turn, at this point, as you know, starts being very connected with Eastern Europe, with the foundation of the Rus, the contact with Constantinople. So we look at sort of very interesting things in the process. These Scandinavians had their own important equestrian tradition. Again, we will make videos especially on that. The Vendel era is quite revealing in many ways. We see people coming from far away, Turkic influence, like in these cases. as we understood, the stirrup was, however, mostly spreading within the Frankish system because heavier cavalry and broader forces of heavy cavalry charges that also, in fact, these other peoples had to cope with. All right. Most of the transformative changes would occur in cavalry tactics, however, in the late 9th or early 10th centuries. The Carolingian knights, so to say, were still tied in a sense. They were still a hybrid with the older migration era. Fighting styles, the same collective cavalry charges were absolutely there, but they were also mixed with some kind still of more, say, individual melee, some kind of greater dispersion, and there is an important level of infantry capacity even in Carolingian times, even though the core of the imperial army is definitely constituted by militias. Again, a charge of whom you would have not liked to withstand, but that were also very eager to dismount, and often having to do that in the fringe of the Carolingian Empire was quite wild and undeveloped compared to, again, Gaul, and where most of the manpower in the northeast was based in. Now, in East Francia, especially during the late 9th and the 10th century, the Magyars, a skilled horse riding people, drove some kind of advancements in cavalry warfare. You can't say that they were the leaders, because again, the Eastern Franks were somehow quite developed and part of what was historically, again, the Frankish tradition at that point. They had a Vassalitic beneficiary system. Yes, they had sort of less developed cavalry than Gaul, but at large, they had their own important equestrian forces that, again, as we've seen in the Battle of Riade, would be able to cope with the Magyars that, again, were not militarily superior to the Eastern Franks, that needed to achieve, however, political cohesion in order to kick these guys out. In West Francia, the strategic rather than tactical threat posed by the Vikings prompted, of course, the use of large numbers of well-equipped, well-trained, readily deployable, and highly mobile mounted troops. However, this was also the simple consequence of that notorious, historiographically notorious process of say, political disgregation that the Western Frankish kingdom went under in these years, and that was triggered exactly by the rise of prominence already, in fact, in the later Carolingian period of this beneficiaries of the Vassalitic system that were ever more entrenched into their private possessions, used as a sort of prepaid wealth to be able, as a precondition to exercise their military service for the emperor, but that when were not sort of to be rewarded anymore for their service, given the overstretching of the Carolingian Empire, had not much of another interest of going out there or responding authority, because there wasn't really a state north of the Alps. Regardless of the fact that surely the Carolingian reforms did bring some important, flexible and promising system of further development, passing through the same Vassalitic beneficiary system in these very lords at the local level, they were in fact to mostly start creating their own seigneuries rather than obeying to some central authority that, however, was always recognized as the ultimate public one, and one that could also sanction, in fact, their own historical privileges, their allodiia, and again, this course of power from which, in fact, some of the most important princely families of Europe will eventually rise. As you understand, talking about horses is difficult because it's not much, again, the equine or even the harness per se that is so crucially important, or that went under such radical transformations over time. But there are these little indicators that give you a pretty obvious picture of what was going on overall in terms of military developments and political and social ones, as we know from a Clausewitzian point of view, that we can insert as yet another tacit in our big mosaic, let's say, of videos here. I have surely a playlist dedicated to the warhorse. This is the 9th video we make about warhorses. This is quite interesting. We add it to death. Nevertheless, we shall continue, of course, and we shall especially increase even this content, because this also goes in the, I don't know whether in the medieval knighthood, like probably, yeah, which would be our 74th video, and there is really a lot about knights, right? We have to be honest about this. There is really a lot, and we should definitely be thankful for it, because it's such great content. I don't know how many people actually watch it. Let me see the playlist here. Probably, well, fair amount, but there could be historically more. And again, we will surely increase all the content, all the playlists, whatever I see here, that overall the channel grows, but we need to be a bit more consistent with especially the frequency of the views, because the channel in and of itself cannot simply sustain itself, but some random spikes. Like, there must be a much more organic following and watching. Again, it depends on the topics, right? But let's say if I make a video on the Battle of Pharsalus and I get only, I don't know, 500 views in a couple of days, you understand there is something wrong. The video about the Roman decuries, it didn't surpass 300 views in a day. Like, I have almost 28,000 subscribers. This is a bit ridiculous, telling the truth. Yeah, I know that YouTube is messed up, but let's say if you are so consistent in clicking on videos like the one on Peterson, I think you can do yourself a favor and look also at this kind of content, which is, again, very important. It can't be bypassed, and I know it seems secondary to an extent. People are into gossip. They want to know what this guy thinks or says about it, rather than seeing that this is an already pre-planned and quite carefully crafted and homogeneous and mutually reliant and intertwined amount of knowledge that you're supposed to watch as a unicum, not as some sort of random collage of stuff, right? So if you don't get that, if you still watch Schwerpunkt looking at the hit of the moment in terms of gossip or whatever, you're not going to go very far. And I mean it just by yourself in a deeper fashion. And there is really a lot to do. Really something that we have to be more consistent with at such a greater level. But again, I'm fairly confident that we're going to work this out, and if you keep supporting the channel, everything will come our way. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.